many thanks. Good morning for everyone. I would to thank the kindly invitation of Ariel Tvonsky to present today in the Central Bank of Argentina, an institution which the first general manager was Raul Prebisch, the greatest Latin American economist of all times. So it's a great honor for me. So let me share my presentation. Okay. Share. Well, so this workshop by members of the Structural Development Macroeconomics Research Group. Well, I think that the first question that we have to answer before presenting the model is how to model a small open economy. In order to answer this question, we have to have several issues in mind. The first issue, the first important issue, is regarding the elasticity of labor supply. We can have two cases: a mature economy where labor supply is inelastic and balanced growth requires equality between natural growth rate, warranted growth rate, and actual growth rate, or a dual economy where labor supply is unlimited in the sense of Lewis in his work of 1954, which means that growth is limited only by the growth of capital stock. The second issue is about the nature of the technological progress. Technological progress can be exogenous, so the growth rate of labor productivity is exogenous and independent of the actual growth rate of real output. For instance, this is exactly what happens in Solus One models of exogenous growth. Or technological progress can be endogenous. The growth rate of labor productivity depends on the actual growth rate of real output due to the existence of a dynamic economies of scale and or the fact that the rate of employment due to the entrepreneur's search for labor-saving technical progress as a result of increases in the real wages or in wage share. The third issue is regarding the level of openness of capital account. We have three possible cases. The first one, the capital account is closed. In this case, interest rate differentials had no influence over capital flows or hence over the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. We have an intermediate case where capital account is open but imperfect. Interest rate differential result in a positive but finite rate of change of capital flows and hence over the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. And finally, we have the book case, the textbook case, perfect capital mobility in Mundell sense, where arbitrage operations between foreign and domestic investors make the domestic interest rate to be equal to the level of international rate of interest plus the country risk premium. Another issue is the nature of tradable goods. Tradable goods could be homogeneous throughout the world, so the law of one price holds, which means that real exchange rate is constant at the level given by the purchasing power parity. Or tradable goods are imperfect substitutes, which means that domestic and foreign goods can be different prices. In this case, real exchange rate is no longer constant, but can change as a result of changes in the monopoly power of domestic firms or changes in the unit labor costs of manufacturing industries. Another issue is about the exchange rate regime. We have two cases. The first one, the one that Argentina used in the 90s during Carlos Menem government, is a fixed exchange rate. The monetary authorities set the level of nominal exchange rate that is considered ideal for policy purposes. Or we can have a managed floating. In the case of managed floating, the nominal exchange rate changes due to capital flows, but monetary authorities can intervene in the exchange market by means of accumulation of international reserves. This was the case of Brazil, for instance, from 2006 to 2013. Other issue is about the goals of monetary policy. I think that we can have basically nowadays two goals or two frameworks for monetary policy. The first one is what I call strict inflation targeting. That is the case of Brazil. Monetary authority only or most important goal is to make actual inflation equal to some numerical target for CPI variation over some length of time. In Brazil, the time length is 1 year. Or we can have a flexible way inflation targeting, where monetary authorities have implicitly or explicitly a double mandate, is to stabilize inflation at the target level and capacity utilization at potential or desired level. Finally, the last issue is for post-Keynesian economists is particularly relevant, which is the source of autonomous demand growth. We have basically two sources, domestic demand, that can be private or government consumption. I think that is the most preferred source of autonomous demand growth for Fabio Freitas and the people of the Raffian super multiplier, or foreign demand, which means exports, which is the preferable source of autonomous demand growth for new developmentalist Brazilian school of thought. Well, now the standard models for open economies. I think that the first standard model is the Kaldorian cumulative causation models, which seminal paper is the Dixon-Tiro paper of 1975. These models have in general four equations. A first equation where the growth rate of real output is a function of the growth rate of exports. A second equation in which the growth rate of exports is a function of the rate of change of terms of trade and the growth rate of world's income. A third equation that specifies the productivity growth rate as a function of the growth rate of real output, which is a simple formalization of Kaldor-Verdun's law. And the fourth equation, where the rate of change of domestic prices is determined by the rate of change in nominal wages, the growth rate of productivity, and the rate of change of nominal exchange rate. Well, these models has a problem because they are not in general compatible with a balance of payments constraint, a fact that is admitted by Anthony Tiro himself. Well, the second standard model is the balance of payments constrained growth models. For open economies with closed capital account, which is the seminal paper of Tiro in 1979, the growth rate of real output is given by the ratio of demand elasticities of exports and imports multiplied by the growth rate of foreign income. For open economy with open capital accounts, for instance, in the paper of Moreno Bride, published in Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics in 1998-1999, the growth rate of real output depends not only on the income elasticities and the growth rate of foreign income, but also on the initial ratio of exports to imports, which can be shown to be equal to the ratio between exports to GDP and the sum of current account deficit to GDP and exports to GDP. And in this case, an increase in the current account deficit to GDP will reduce the growth rate of real output compatible with balance of payments equilibrium. This I showed in my 2016 book written. There are problems with balance of payments constrained growth models. First, these models fully regards the cumulative causation mechanism as so relevant for Kaldorian growth models, assuming constant terms of trade, then productivity gains induced by economic growth had no role in the dynamics of the system in such a way that they become strictly irrelevant. However, in this case, the system no longer has any adjustment mechanism between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This deficiency was observed by Pele on his 2002 article, for whom the balance of payments constrained growth model would be inconsistent in the extent that only in a happy coincidence would be possible the equality between the growth rate compatible with the balance of payments equilibrium and the natural growth rate, that is, the one that keeps the unemployment rate constant over time. In this way, the balance of payments constrained growth models does not seem in general compatible with a balanced growth path. Last but not least, the balance of payments constrained growth models fully neglected the relationship between the level of real exchange rate and long-term growth. Indeed, in those models, the long-term equilibrium growth rate depends on the ratio of exports and importing elasticities multiplied by the rest of the world growth rate. Thus, real exchange rate variations are assumed to be relevant to long-term growth, either because empirical evidence shows that export and import price elasticities are low in such way that the impact of real devaluation of exchange rate over the growth path of exports and imports is low, either because the terms of trade do not show a systematic trend of appreciation or depreciation in the long term. Well, then I have an alternative that I have been working since 2018 in a seminal paper published in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy, written by me and my former master student, Bernardo Santana. We developed a Kaldorian growth model that, one, incorporates the balance of payments constraints, eliminating the inconsistency presented on balance of payments constrained growth models. Two, establish a mechanism by which the level of real exchange rate may affect the long-term growth of capitalist economies. Santana and Oreiro 2018 model incorporates some innovations introduced by myself in an article published in 2009 into the structure of Kaldorian growth models, such as the conduction of monetary policy in inflation targeting regime, nominal interest rate determined by a Taylor rule, a floating exchange rate regime, and imperfective capital mobility. In contrast to the Oreiro 2009 model, however, Santana and Oreiro 2018 model assume a balance of payments constraints in which the growth rate of international capital inflows is a positive function of the differential between the domestic interest rate and international interest rate plus the country risk premium. In this context, the differential between the domestic and international interest rates plus the risk premium will also determine the rate of depreciation or appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. Another important innovation introduced in the model was the hypothesis that the Kaldor-Verdun coefficient, which captures the sensibility of the rate of growth of labor productivity with respect to the rate of growth of real output, depends on the manufacturing share on output. This hypothesis allowed to introduce into the model the possibility of a structural change, which is understood as a dynamic process by which the manufacturing share of output changes over time. In this way, it was possible to analyze the dynamic properties of the model, both in the case where the productivity structure is kept constant and in a situation in which it changes due to some economic process. Well, so the model that I made for the conference is a new Kaldorian model with balance of payments constrained growth. What are the properties of the model? First of all, we will assume that monetary policy is conducted under a flexible inflation targeting regime, where the goal of the monetary policy is not only to achieve a certain target for inflation, but also stabilize the pace totalization at its potential or target level. Second, we will assume that potential or target level of capacity utilization depends on lagged variable of this variable. This hypothesis captures the hysteresis effect of lower output growth over potential output, which is a phenomena well documented in recent literature. Finally, we will assume that inflation expectations depend on the credibility of the central bank. In the case where central bank is fully credible, then inflation expectations are equal to the target inflation. Otherwise, they are determined by a simple adaptive rule, which will introduce a level of inflation inertia in the model. In the long run equilibrium with the structural change, it was shown, that's the main result, that a decrease in the target inflation could increase the growth rate of real output, the capacity utilization, the rate of employment, and the manufacturing share in GDP, becoming a driver of the process of structural change. So you can see that the model shows a positive correlation between the growth rate of real output and the manufacturing share. That's an important feature of this model, and a feature that is compatible with the empirical findings of the relevant literature. Since monetary policy can affect the productive structure of the economy, as well as the growth rate of real output and the rate of employment, then it is not possible to separate macroeconomics from economic development, which is the core of the so-called structuralist development macroeconomics, which is the theoretical basis of the Brazilian new developmentalist school. Well, some other remarks about the model. Although the model was developed for a small open economy, it is designed for a mature economy in the sense of Lewis. Labor supply is inelastic, and real output growth has to be equal to the natural growth rate in the long run. The natural growth rate is, however, endogenous because productivity growth depends both on output growth and employment rate. So the natural growth rate adjusts itself to the actual growth rate of real output determined by the balance of payments constraint due to changes in the level of employment. And finally, in order for a balanced growth path to exist, it was also necessary to make the autonomous component of investment demand an endogenous variable in the long run, as done by Lavoie in his 2016 paper in Macroeconomics. Well, I think, Ariel, how much time I have?
You have 15 minutes left.
Oh, 15 minutes, all right. So I will present briefly the structure of the model. Basically, the model have 3 or 4 blocks of equations. Equations 1, 2, and 3 represents the balance of payments constraint. Equation 1, the dynamic equation for exports. Equation 2, the dynamic equation for imports. The equation 3 is the balance of payments constraint, assuming capital inflows, where the growth rate of capital inflows is F hat. The growth rate of capital inflows, F hat, is determined in the equation 4 by the interest rate differential, where F measures the degree of openness of capital account. Equation 5 relates the rate of change of nominal exchange rate with capital inflows. If capital inflows are positive, then the exchange rate will appreciate over time. The coefficient K measures the intervention of the level of intervention of central bank in the exchange rate market. The equation 6 is the Taylor's rule for a flexible inflation targeting. Beta 0 is the equilibrium exchange rate for an open economy, which is equal to the international interest rate plus country risk premium. Equation 7 shows that the target or normal or whatever what you can say target utilization rate had an hysteresis effect. So it depends on the lagged variable of the capacity utilization. Equation 8 is the goods market equilibrium. We are assuming no government activities. Equation 9 is the consumption function. Equation 10 is a simple investment equation where the growth rate of capital stock depends on an autonomous component and the real expected interest rate. Equation 10a assumes that inflation expectations is equal to the target inflation. So we are assuming a fully credible monetary policy. Equation 11 shows the net exports as a ratio of the capital stock. Equation 14 shows the price setting of firms in an open economy. The level of prices depends on the real exchange rate, E, and nominal wage rate, and the level of productivity. Equation 15 defines the real wage relevant for consumers. Consumers consume both domestic and foreign goods, so there is a bundle of consumption goods. Equation 16 redefines the real wage relevant for consumers as dependent on the level of productivity and inversely with the real exchange rate. So an increase in productivity increases real wages, but depreciation of real exchange rate reduces real wage. V bar represents the target real wage by unions. LT is the employment rate. Equation 18 represents the wage inflation, which depends on target inflation and distributive conflict between unions and capitalists. And equation 19 represents the domestic inflation, which is a weighted average of international inflation and exchange rate variation, and plus the increase in unit labor cost. All right. And equation 20 is the productivity growth, which depends on the real growth rate and the level of employment lag in one period. So the model has a short-run equilibrium that is represented by equations 1, 2, 3, 4a, 5b, 13a, and 21. I will skip that. Some properties of the short-run equilibrium. Then we have a system of 7 independent equations with 7 unknowns. This means that we have a determinate system, but some observations are required to make about the system of equations. First of all, it allowed us to calculate the level of employment and capacity utilization, as well as the growth rate of real output. This is an important advance in respect to balance of payments. Constrained growth models where only the growth rate of real output can be determined, but not the general level of resources utilization. Second, the interdependence of equations of the model is not general. The model is block recursive in the sense of Sargent, 1987. Indeed, the short-run equilibrium values of capacity utilization and inflation rate could be entirely determined by equations 13a and 21 alone. Once these variables are determined, equations 4a and 5b determine the growth rate of capital flows and the rate of exchange rate depreciation. And once these values are determined, equations 1 and 3 determine the growth rate of imports, the growth rate of exports, and the growth rate of real output that is compatible with balance of payments equilibrium. So, how many time I had, Ariel?
You have 8 minutes.
All right. The balance growth with structural change. Well, in balance of growth, inflation rate is kept constant. Inflation expectations equal to target. Capital utilization, capacity utilization is constant. Growth rate of real output is constant. The manufacturing share is constant but exogenous, and the real exchange rate is constant but exogenous. So we have the system of equations for a balanced growth without a structural change. The important thing that I have to comment is that equation 31 is absolutely necessary for a balanced growth path to exist, which means that the growth rate of real output compatible with balance of payments equilibrium has to be equal to the growth rate of capital stock. In order for this equality to hold, the autonomous component of investment demand can be transformed in an endogenous variable in the long run, dependent on the difference between the growth rate of real output and the growth rate of capital stock. And equation 32a determines the steady state or balanced growth path of autonomous component of investment demand. Well, the model with structural change, equation 33, represents the dynamics of the manufacturing share. The dynamics of manufacturing share has three components. Our autonomous component are components that depends on the real exchange rate, and more importantly, it is an important advance in respect to the Brasser Pereira definition of industrial equilibrium exchange rate. I introduced the technological gap. For me, the industrial equilibrium exchange rate will be the level of real exchange rate that makes manufacturing share constant over time. So equation 34 determines the industrial equilibrium exchange rate that is no longer an ad hoc or exogenous variable to the model. Equation 35 then determines the dynamics of the manufacturing share, which can be simplified as the difference between the actual level of exchange rate and the equilibrium or industrial level of exchange rate. Equation 36b, the dynamics of real exchange rate, and the system, equation 39, the dynamics of real exchange rate in steady state. E dot have to be hat has to be equal to 0, so we have equation 14. Well, the system, the dynamic system for a structural change is represented in figure 2. It is a stable equilibrium. It is shown by Oleg theorem presented in the paper. The most interesting result is that a decrease in inflation targeting shift the E hat curve to the right, so increasing the steady state level of manufacturing share in output. And finally, table 1 represents the effects of changes in inflation targeting over the growth rate of real output, capacity utilization, employment rate, and manufacturing share. We show that a decrease in target inflation will increase the growth rate of real output, the steady state level of rate of employment, the steady state level of capacity utilization, and the steady state level of manufacturing share in GDP. So, summing up, the main objective of this paper was to show that monetary policy, especially the target inflation, can have a long-term influence on real output growth, capacity utilization, employment rate, and the productive structure of small open economies with imperfect capital mobility, flexible inflation targeting regime, and its stresses. With this goal, a Kaldorian model of balance of payments constrained growth was developed, in which monetary policy, price and wage setting, productivity growth, and structural change has a central role in the interaction between inflation and economic growth. Although the model was developed for a small open economy, it is designed for a mature economy in the sense of Lewis. Labor supply is inelastic, and real output growth had to be equal to the natural growth rate in the long run. The natural growth rate is, however, endogenous because productivity growth depends both on output growth and employment rate. The natural growth rate adjusts itself to the actual growth rate of real output, determined by the balance of payments constraint due to changes in the level of employment. In order for a balanced growth path to exist, it was also necessary to make the autonomous component of investment demand an endogenous variable in the long run, as done by Lavoie. And finally, The main result of the model is that a reduction in the target inflation will result in an increase in the long-run rate of real output, rate of employment, capacity utilization, and manufacturing share. This means that monetary policy is not neutral, which is a very post-Keynesian result, even in the long run, and has the capacity to permanently change the productive structure of the economy, increasing the manufacturing share. As the manufacturing share is decisive for the process of technological progress and economic development, it is clear that monetary policy is capable of affecting the development path of the economy. This means that it is not possible to separate macroeconomics from economic development. This conclusion is in accordance with those so-called structuralist development macroeconomics, which is the theoretical basis of the Brazilian New Developmental School. And this is my contact. Thanks very much for your time and patience.